Nisha.
Hello,
Hi.
how are you?
I'm okay. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's been a little bit of a journey for me.
Yeah, you've been moving, right?
Yeah, I'm in Ontario right now, but I'm actually going back to Edmonton. My classes got moved online. So
Oh shit. Oh shit. Did
yeah,
you come to have in-person classes and now they've been
I
moved online?
did. Yes, that is exactly what happened. But like my
Dude.
partner is back in Edmonton, so I was like, that's okay. Like I will. So I found a sublet for this place, and I'm just gonna go
Wow.
back for the semester. Any more time at home
Okay.
is fine, like my family's there and stuff. But it's been a whole journey. It's been a hassle.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah, a turbulent departure, turbulent arrival, and
Yeah,
now another departure.
yeah, exactly. I'm just gonna put my phone on silent.
Cool.
All right, go ahead.
Cool. All right. Well, I'll offer a quick summary before we start. First, it's obviously pretty, so if you'd like to start over at any time, that's totally cool. We'll start with talking about Maza Arts Collective, and then about poetry readings in general. Makes them great.
You're
What
kind
makes
of
great ones
cutting
great.
in and out.
I've had issues with this in the past. Let's see. Is that any better?
Speak for a little bit longer.
To be or not to be, that is the question, whether
Yeah,
tis
I think
nobler.
that's a lot better.
That's better. Okay. So yeah, just quickly a summary. We will discuss the Maza Arts Collective. I'll ask you how it got started, what its trajectory since then has been, what makes for a great reading, what makes things easier as an organizer in terms of coordinating with guests and how they can make that maximally efficient for you.
For
And
sure.
then your relationship with land acknowledgements and what that process has been like and how you think about that on Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton. And then a word about the transition online that you've inevitably gone through as a result of the pandemic, and then what you've got upcoming. And hopefully we'll keep things to about 20 minutes or so if that works.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. This is episode 3 of Talking with the Organizers, presented by Antler River Poetry, formerly Poetry London, this week featuring the Maza Arts Collective with co-founder Nisha Patel. Nisha, thank you very much for the gift of your time this afternoon.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So you co-founded Maza Arts, self-described as a national queer femme South Asian artist collective in 2019. And I wonder whether you'd say a few words about its motivating impetus and its trajectory since then.
Yeah, the Arts Collective really came about quite as a result of the fact that when I entered into the poetry world and started attending, especially competitions nationally, there was really like what I felt a lack of representation for Indo-Canadians or Indian people or brown people from different diasporas, not just from India, but South Asian people in general. And I felt especially that those first few years where I was performing in like increasingly public positions, that this was an isolation that really like was cutting at me. And the few instances where I found other South Asian poets, I really felt a sense of connection to them. And it became almost like a natural conversation to have. The collective exists as a group of people who have come together to support one another. And, some days that means that we just have, regular conversations. Other days it means we take on projects or we share opportunities with each other. Really, our goals are to exist in conversation with one another and really try to build each other up and share that experience with one another and share our skills.
Amazing. I wonder how this collective has been informed by or has informed your tenure as poet laureate in Edmonton.
Yeah.
Would you like sometimes do a bit of group think, like, well, what do you think about, they just asked me to do this thing, well, how can we do this? And
Right. When I was poet laureate, which I just ended after 2 years back in June, for me as a South Asian poet in that position, I often felt that there there were people who treat you differently, right, in that public facing role, but you're being treated differently from people who aren't poets, right? The poets themselves treat you as, you know, a colleague or a friend. They don't put you on a pedestal, or they don't look down on you. The Maza collective is really like, you know, connected in that way. And there were many challenges where I was like, hey, I'm going to write about this difficult thing. Can I get another set of eyes on it? Can I get some feedback? You know, even when I was applying to graduate school, it was kind of like there were some big letdowns, some rejections, where the first place I went to was the collective to be like, hey, you know, I need some sympathy here. And it came, right? Like these are people who are from all over Canada who are coming together to really support one another.
Amazing. This sounds like the sort of quintessence of a phrase that I saw associated with your bio of being a community builder. Like you're actively catalyzing these communities, which maybe already exist, but you're, I don't know, bring people together, I suppose. You know?
Yeah, I think like there's no one who really is truly alone in some of these like public art forms. You know, even if you're a poet who doesn't like other poets, you still perform sometimes to an audience, and that in itself breaks isolation. And so, you know, when we're doing things like that, how can we make sure that we are in the presence of the people we actually care about or that we actually want to reach? And I think like one of the things that happens naturally is that as you progress in a poetry career, you become very aware that there are communities out there who are there for you, and then communities where you would like allies or support to come from.
Amazing. So you'd mentioned being in front of an audience there, and I wonder whether you'd say a word about, in your experience of, you know, hundreds of performances around the world as a spoken word artist, as well as your position as a host and organizer of readings. What makes for a great reading? What makes for a memorable performance?
Yeah, it's such a large and loaded question, but I think the poet who succeeds in a poetry reading is the person who is able to connect not just to other people, but to that moment and to that space. So if you think of space in terms of like, you know, the space-time continuum or whatever, each moment is unique, right? And to occupy a poetic space is a unique offering. So even if you read the same poems in a different poetic space, it will never be the same. Even if you try to recreate it, you can't get back what you had in that moment. So, you know, instead of meeting people where they are or meeting audiences where they are, how do you meet the potential of that moment, right? Did that moment live up to every, you know, machination of the universe that you want it to be? And that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of internal you know, monitoring and external monitoring. It takes skill, and sometimes it just takes luck. You know, you pick the right poem for the right people, and together you create something with an audience that is bigger than just two people talking to one another.
Amazing. That was brilliant. Holy shit. So I'm wondering about, if you don't mind me asking a question about your poet laureateship and how you'd be asked presumably to produce like works for particular occasions. And I think about that, about occasional pieces and whether they ever feel like they're not perfectly in alignment with work that you would have produced but for the occasion, and how that compels like a deep consideration, I guess, of like a city structure, and especially one that had been imposed on that land.
Yeah.
Yeah. How did you negotiate that in a way that retained your integrity as a poet?
I still negotiate it now. So in the last 12 months, I have completed the most commissioned or, you know, requested work than I ever have before in my career. And so I created, I think, 20 different commissions for different organizations, some private, some public, you know, nonprofit, charitable. all over the place. Some of it was created for the poet laureateship, some of it was created for events or things that were happening in the city, some of it was created for organizations like the CBC. And what I really had to find was, at first I was really struggling. Like, it was very difficult to match the passion I had for my own personal work with this professional element of it, right? But the solution really becomes finding the thread of yourself in the work that you're doing and connecting not with like external ideas or other people, but connecting with that side of yourself. And so one of the first commissions I did in 2021 was to speak for the Bow Valley College convocation. And I wrote a poem for that convocation. And for me to re-embody the part where I was a student or someone who was graduating, someone who overcame difficulty, at first seems like it's very obvious, but it was like a whole learning process for me. Later on, I did a poem for healthcare workers in Alberta for the Healthcare Workers Union. And that was something I accessed much more readily, right? This idea of righteousness, this idea of justice and equity, those were easier to connect to than others. There have been poems where, I sit there for days and I try my best to come up with the right solution or the right words. And at the end of the day, it always comes down to, how can I see myself in this narrative and how can I connect with that part of myself that wants to be told? And so I view commissions not now as like professional obligations, but as opportunities to express parts of myself that I haven't explored before.
Amazing. I mean, this seems to me to be a wonderful definition of what empathy is, being able to identify with those on behalf of whom you're sort of asked to speak as a poet laureate, as well as empathizing with the experiences that they've just undergone,
Yeah, all of it is empathy. And, it's really funny because sometimes people come up to me with ideas for commissions and they want a specific thing. They want this, they want that, they want this thing they've seen on TV, they want a recreation. And I can't offer recreations. I can only really offer what I have to offer. And, I'd like to think that most people have been pleasantly surprised with the end product. If they're disappointed, they don't tell me. Everyone pays me on time, so it hasn't been an issue. But like some of it is just having a conversation, like, this is who I am, this is what I do, this is what you can expect.
Amazing. So I wonder whether through Maza Arts you've encountered any sort of central or recurring challenges, and I wonder how you've overcome those challenges if challenges have presented themselves.
Yeah. The collective is exactly that. It's a collection of people who have come together. And so there's no, I think, like individual challenge that's just mine. It's we share these challenges together. And the biggest challenge I think we face is this like very real specter of constant financial insecurity as we're creating art. So where do we get the resources, both emotional, financial, spiritual, to create the art we want to create? And by supporting one another, by referring people to work and to resources and to grants and helping each other out, I'm hoping that we are getting closer towards realizing all of our artistic goals, right? That we are supporting one another and sharing in a way that uplifts each other to reach that creative potential that we imagine for ourselves. And so, it is, a little bit, faith only gets you so far. We have faith in each other, but what we need is like systemic and institutional support in many ways under capitalism so that we can see all our ideas come through. Obviously, in a world where these are not contentious issues, where people are given what they need to do what they need to do, I think the challenges we face would be very different, right? Some of the work we do is very much based in identity, right? It's based in representation. We're still coming up on barriers, right? Where it's like sometimes people don't need to hire 2 South Asian artists because they think their themes are going to overlap, or maybe the publisher will only take on 1 South Asian writer per every 2 years or something like that. So like the barriers we face are not necessarily ones of our own choosing, and maybe in an ideal world, they're not barriers we would face at all.
Hmm. So, I mean, on this point of coming up against or coming at institutions, and I'm anticipating that they'd be sort of shuddering in anticipation of receiving your presence. Speaking specifically about this university that you have just traveled to Ontario for, and which you're going to proceed with online. I wonder if you'd say a word about how your engagement with the institution of the academy aligns with what you're talking about, and and how you negotiate that sort of relationship again between your own sort of personal and artistic integrity and an institution which tends to be behind that leading line of artists who are pushing consciousness forward as we've done, forever.
Yeah, it's such a big journey to return or to enter into like the academic space, right? Because like each of these spaces that we occupy or that work is created in are different places of knowledge. And so to take what is like a community-based art practice and run it through the mill of academia is something I'm very scared of. I don't know what's going to happen to the output that I've put in, but also what I'm going to achieve. And what I'm hoping for is that academia is like a place of transformation for me to add another lens of understanding to my work, but that my work continues and remains integral and remains full to the biggest extent that it can be. I have fears obviously about academia, about the whiteness of it, about the the limitations of it, but I also think that like for me as like a creative person, this is more of an opportunity to learn something I don't know than it is a forum for being limited.
Amazing. So I wonder if you'd say a few words about how you think about land acknowledgements in your position as a host on Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, and what benefit land acknowledgements as they appear before readings or sort of cultural events of any kind, and increasingly in academia as well. What benefit they can have for those in the audience, and what they do, and yeah, sort of the texture of your thinking with regard to land acknowledgements would be fascinating to
Yeah,
hear.
I think it's a it's a very interesting space to be in. Uh, for some South Asian people, we come from cultures who are in themselves colonizers in other places, but some of us are not settlers in the same way. We are settlers in that we settled here, but some of us are refugees, some of us are asylum seekers, some of us are people who have been brain drained from other parts of the world and brought here on lucrative work permits, stuff like, or do you call those people settlers? Like,
Right.
Is
Yeah,
there another word that we should be using?
totally.
One that I recently encountered from the academic setting was this idea of arrivant, someone who has
Mm,
arrived, has different obligations, but maybe they don't, right? Maybe it doesn't matter what those contexts are, but that we come here and we still engage with the spirit of treaty and the clauses of treaty and stuff like that. And
mm,
so land acknowledgements, I think, in order to be effective mechanisms for acknowledgement of obligations and relationships, must come from a very personal point of view. They can't be rote, they can't be memorized and spit out, they can't be repetitious, they have to be crafted with the intentions of the treaty itself, right? So if I was going to come here and uphold treaty obligations as someone who lives in Canadian society, with other nations who live here outside of Canadian society, what burdens and what obligations would I bring to that relationship? And how can I communicate some of those obligations out loud? And I think that is a difficult thing to do when we haven't been brought up as Canadians to understand the nation to nation relationships that First Nations, Indigenous, Métis people have with Canada and with the the different systems that are at play here. On the other hand, I also think it's important that we don't perform these types of things, right? That we don't add them into our shows just because we think we have to. It's okay to have a flawed understanding of some of these relationships as long as you're seeking out further knowledge. My partner has ancestors who signed Treaty 6. My children in the future will be Indigenous folks who will have those same ancestors, right? So what obligations do I have as someone who is entering into someone else's relationship to treaty and someone else's relationship to land? And how can I impart my own knowledge without burdening the people around me, right? Like, these are all important things to take into account. Do I think we should do land acknowledgements? I think you should acknowledge your relationship to other people in many different ways, right? Sometimes maybe a verbal acknowledgement is the best way to get that across. But if it's not matched with your actions, if it's not matched with your complex understanding of your own positionality with others or your own privilege, then I don't think it serves any purpose at all, right? If you're going to a new treaty location and you don't understand all the signatories or something like that, I don't think we would, like, if you go to France, for instance, you have to enter with a passport, right? And you go through a big airport, and you know what, like, the nations who lived here deserve the same respect and the same, acknowledgement that they are not Canadian, right? That we are on someone else's land, and being aware of that is just the absolute bare minimum that we can do, I think, as artists who are settlers or arrivants or people who have come here to make life.
Astonishing. So I wonder about the transition for the Maza collective online over the course of the pandemic, and perhaps with specific regard to the question of accessibility in the context of a move online. I've got a dear friend who embraced the move online because it meant that she was able to, or they were able to actually participate in the events, if they took place in the afternoons. And now that, everything's coming back to normal, and I can't imagine what this sort of situation is like in Alberta in that regard, from like a day-to-day perspective. If people are just completely dismissing the possibility of the existence of the pandemic any further, there seems to me that they've maybe had enough of it. At any rate, I wonder how you think about this relationship between or this transition rather online, and maybe the relationship between community and the possibility of diverse communities existing within an accessible framework online, and what that adds and what that detracts to the possibility of fruitfulness of those interactions.
For sure. This is like a very personal question for me, because I continued to experience disability during the pandemic, and I became further disabled while I was in the pandemic. And at the same time, I was someone who was still performing for a living and still doing all the same things that I used to do, sometimes even more. I went on a 25 show book tour, for instance, all of which is to say that some of these things, most of these things, would not have been possible without the accommodations people were finally affording to disabled folks. But honestly, even if you aren't disabled, some of these accessibilities have been mere conveniences, and that's enough of a reason to keep some of that moving forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like having events where something is recorded and you can view it privately after, being able to attend a show with your camera off, right? Being able to come in late and leave right away, not having to park or get a vehicle or take transit for an hour or fly across the country to do a show in Vancouver, or Toronto or something like that. Like, I was able to connect to audiences, online, but audiences that I sometimes would never have met otherwise. And I was able to do it from the safety and security of my home, obviously with the privilege of having like stable internet and access to those online resources. So there's whole conversations that really we could be having here about what accessibility is. What I think we need to be doing as organizers is putting the needs of the most vulnerable and marginalized folks in our artistic communities first, and building backwards from that. So it's not an add-on thought. It's not something that we are reacting to, but that we are proactive in building accessible space, right? And so, like as an organizer, there's still a lot that I have to do when it comes to that. I still have to learn how to caption better, or to do alt text, right? To speak sometimes, or to have interpretation or other languages. Like these are all dimensions of accessibility, right? And something that's really stuck with me is this idea of like what disability even is, right? What accessibility even is. Because in an ideal society that has people who are differently abled all over the place, there is no such thing as disability. There's merely a system that supports all of us, right? And therefore no one is disabled, right? Or everyone is disabled, and it doesn't matter, right? The label doesn't matter. So like, how do we as artists who are often at the forefront of transformative movements, how do we build those into our practice and become like the models or the blueprints for other organizations and other aspects of society?
Amazing. So what has Maza Arts got coming up that our online audience might be aware of?
Yeah, Maza has been working very hard, and some of our members are actually, I don't even know if I'm allowed to tell people, but they are working on some very exciting online content right now, some editorial and curatorial content. And they are just hammering out all the details because we received a grant to do that work. And that grant was written by some of our members, and it's being taken on and executed by even more of our members. So it's the first kind of major Maza Arts Collective project that's going to hit the internet, I guess, in some ways. And I guess you could say it's an online online magazine, online space. But what it is going to be is that we are going to be highlighting South Asian voices in so-called Canada for as a starters, and that we might do other stuff on top of that. I personally am really just acting as someone who is here for extra support, but there are some very eager and excited members of the collective who are steering and really taking it on, and seeing that vision through.
Amazing. It was such a privilege to speak with you this afternoon, especially given the sort of turbulence of the context, your arrival and departure. So this has been episode 3 of Talking with the Organizers, presented by Antler River Poetry, formerly Poetry London, this week featuring the Maza Arts Collective co-founder Nisha Patel. Nisha, thank you again so much. This was tremendous.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Take care.